So currently, desalinization is a process that requires an reasonable amount of electricity, I suppose. That's what people are claiming, right? And then you have your clean water for farming, but that takes electricity. So then you have to have solar panels, which take up land. But if you have a big desert and not farms filling it all up yet, like in a lot of the world, then you get to this scenario here in this video where they're actually building.
Let's take a closer look. Southeast Asia's electricity use is rising fast. On average, the region's demand is growing at about 6% a year. That's nearly twice the global rate. Urban centers like Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore are expanding vertically and digitally. More buildings, more cooling systems, more data centers. Singapore's power use per capita is among the highest in Asia. And most of it still comes from fossil fuels. Singapore relies.
Okay, I would first like to point out the data centers for running, things like someday everybody's cars on a safe system. Everything, all of that isn't as huge as you'd think it would need to be. That's decades ago. I mean, I'm talking now. I have a little B-Link computer. Since 2020, they've been coming out, and they're getting as powerful as desktops from a decade before them, with external plugins for GPUs. So, my point is, there would be enough excess computing power just off of everybody's, computers and their phones and cars to handle future traffic, driving itself a little bit in certain circumstances on freeways and stuff. Now, this video isn't even about that. I was just going to point that out.
Imported natural gas for over 95% of its electricity.
So, one of the things about data centers is when you're using dirty energy, like a lot of NVIDIA type setups for computing that everybody is fond of because it makes them feel good. But it's also inefficient until recently. So they've just kind of been behind the interlacing of everything, technology of electricity. But it's starting to catch up. I've done a lot of videos on it. Clean hydrogen energy, hydrogen from dams, for example, into electricity, is able to run data centers much, much cooler, much, much less electricity using crystal gem based architectures that AMD and other companies have been doing for a long time, for 50 to 100 years. And then back in the day, there's big crystal computers that were part of buildings that had various applications and uses mathematically for, computing amounts of grain and weighing it and doing different things. And all that was destroyed in war. And then all the books get burnt talking about all the old tech. So I could go on all day about how the past was just, it wasn't more fascist really. How did it work, right? There was these big empires. How did anything happen? Why is everything so greedy and thefty in the modern era, even though there's more of everything? Well, I mean, that just comes down to people's innate behaviors and the structures they've built up, how they live in these big clustered cities that just mess everything up, of course. But as cities become super modern and green and hubs for different things, and it becomes more logical slowly, somewhat, and people spread out a little bit more as transit becomes quicker, we reach these scenarios where what becomes important is the quality of the energy. How clean is this energy? How cleanly are the electrons all lining up and doing their dance as the computer needs precision for various applications, for fine measurements with lasers, whatever. I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole list, but that's what this video is ultimately about. How do we get enough green, clean energy to places like Singapore and other places that, and China and anywhere that wants to have these super cities with all the lights on and be like moths fluttering around, bouncing off all of the shops like they're window shopping. It's kind of weird, but you know, I can still understand the appeal on vacation to do it once or twice a decade, maybe for myself. But let's go on here.
It burns the gas in combined cycle plants and pipes it in from neighboring countries. This system is dependable but exposed, both to price volatility every day a year. Solar irradiance in that zone often exceeds 6.5.
Yeah, so everybody knows Australia's dry for long periods, so hence these solar farms. Now, these solar farms, they have to then have big batteries, and that's because everything is being done, I always talk about this, is being done digitally instead of raw style. Like, everything is digitally quantified with tiny little circuits and batteries and stuff for NVIDIA graphics processing. Whereas AMD just has crystal chips that are refined at micro angles, and then it just sends out data and splashes it into like a collection zone or a like electron spin up zone or various other methods off of the jewels. And then you just send the instructions with the lasers or the, you know, hot electric pipelines and of other types other than lasers. And it just generates all of the necessary graphical computing you need easily, and all of the measurements and fine requirements of mathematics for computing for a modern computer. So if everybody's going to be doing it interlaced, their electrical grids is basically what they're doing with these batteries. They're just obsessed with interlacing everything. So I have to adapt what I'm going to describe here today so that people get what they want, which is like a dual current, because their hearts are twisting all the flow, mostly on the left side with most people in the modern era. So they're right-handed, but their heart is on their left side of their body, and all of their nerves and everything, hammer and sickle style, I've just talked about this a lot, are all twisting at different angles up through the shoulder on the right side, so that it has fine-tuned, you know, mechanical use. But then the heart, which is thwumpy-wumping, and really inefficiently in most people, squeezing, you know, all the blood and lymph around their body, has to be over on their left side. This is so inefficient in how dead everyone is. And then all of that fuel and feeding of fine-tuning into the nerves of the body is kind of twisted and sumped out as everything's twisted through the skull and through the shoulders, through the guts, the ribs, all at angles to spin over, so that you have one side of your body doing one thing, providing all the energy over for the fine use on the other side. It's like a overly complexified system. Of course, I'm using herbs, careful diet, and exercise to slowly combat all of those issues and all of the maladies and bacteriums that feed on forcing everyone's bodies into these constricted, twisted passages of flow. And then that bacteria runs everybody's brains and they can't think straight. And then they can't come up with simple um, solutions for the movement of electricity out of deserts here, for example, today.
5 kilowatt hours per square meter per day. And there are hundreds of thousands of hectares.
Yeah, right. So nobody's going to do anything with the land. It's just even too hot and nothing's growing in spots, even less than here. There's actually a little bit of sagebrush here. So,
Of unshaded,
how do they do? How am I going to describe this? Currently, they have to have this huge system, and then you have this problem where, right, you can't let dust get on there too much. What are you gonna hire? You gonna hire kangaroos to come in and wipe them all with squeegees? You gonna have automated squeegees that people have to come in, workmen, and repair them after big storms each year? All of that's, silly and costly. And that's why I've described my lightning windmills with, you know, built-in power generation. And that all links into what I'm going to be describing here today.
transmit electricity from a solar farm near Elliott, Northern Territory.
So finally, just recently, we're actually getting people to use direct current to send large amounts of electricity instead of alternating current. So then it's actually like being sucked to its location and distributed. Now, that requires a giant transformer on either end farm to create the necessary push-pull induction like current so that it's flowing like water to another destination. Now, when you factor in how lightning is positively charged and then the underground water across the whole world is negatively charged, right? The earth, it's this whole system to generate thunderstorms. So what I'm going to be describing here today is more green tech that will assist with thunderstorms as well, potentially, if applied right.
To Singapore, using a continuous chain of overhead lines, battery systems.
And all of this, right? All of these big metal lines, and you have to have all the mines and create all that and then upkeep it every decade, no matter how sturdy it's built. Wow. Then you have the giant cables they got to put in under the ocean. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do these things, because what I'm going to describe is just one option that could go down under certain extreme circumstances of earthquakes or something. Something could happen.
And subsea cable. If completed, it would deliver up to 1.75 gigawatts of firm power. That's enough to meet roughly 15% of Singapore's total electricity demand. The cable would become the longest high-voltage.
So they're just starting experimentally with currently with 15% of the need. And it's going to take a couple years to get this project complete, because there has to be so many different companies and different continents all working together to get any of these types of big projects done. And when you have these massive requirements of these towers and everything, it's slowing everything down. You have to have so many workmen that are, healthy enough to do all of this, and then try and have it all automated with trucks. Well, you need simpler tech that's refined back to the ancient sciences that Egypt and other places used. I always come back to that. So here's how Egypt sent large amounts of power. You know how there's a big sandy desert? Well, you know that scene from that movie me and Grant made, I almost said Spy Kids International. No, Men in Black International. In it, they have that gun, that the fusion gun ray, and then they shoot it in the desert in the Sahara, and it creates a big glass chasm. Well, lightning, when it hits sand, it creates, right, a glass sheet layer of hot bubbling ooze. And say a, quartzy, some sort of specialized material steamroller came in right after that happened and smushed it into a certain shape, a nice um, half pipe shape. So what you would be doing is, if you look at the world here, on Google Earth, for example, all of these big deserts across North Africa, for example. Let's go right to the center here. So the sand is up here at 1,300 feet, and you can watch as it'll kind of generally drop all the way down to the sea level steadily. Sometimes, I can hear there's some mountains and stuff, but there's places where it's flowing kind of continuously where when it used to be a jungle thousands of years ago, um, there was big lakes and rivers running into the ocean, right? So so if you have a half pipe, or in some areas completely underground, and it's made out of reflective material, so it's just a big mirror inside of it, right? And you can have layers of these mirrors for different colors of light that you break it up into, so that it's like one of those clown mirrors where you look in a whole room full of mirrors one way and the other, and you see the stacked reflections out into the distance forever. Well, you create some of that effect and keep the temperature of the sunlight that you would be raw shipping, and some of the electrons from lightning strikes to your tower arrays that go into the grid. So you have to have enough infrastructure to handle, as I've described before, a lightning strike and have it Tesla bounce off to other nearby towers, other lightning towers. And I've described the top parasols and how they beam down sunlight and hit. You'd have to make man-made crystals, I described, that would refract the light in big areas that are installed, that shift with the parasols with the day going by, so that the light cascading through the top magnifying glass parasol hits like the elongated crystal, and then the light is refracted. I mean, you can just use carbon diamonds for this, but other experiments can be done. And this energy just from the sun is then hitting the lower tines of the spinning windmill. I've described all this many times. So we need a process to make these big crystals in factories. Currently, they're not making all that big of crystals. And the tech, like, they can print out sheet windows that are thin and flat and slightly curved, which is super good for making big domes and stuff. But it's hard to make big, chunky crystals like soccer ball sized or even bigger, right? So how they're compressing those crystals are just giant pyramid pistons. So the question is, why don't you just make a giant pyramid piston? Um, there's pieces to all of this for this electrical grid energy I'm describing. So there's no water in the desert, but there's water out of here, right? So you have this hot warp pipe of energy coming from either storms in some places from the lightning, or if it's clear, then you'd have it being converted from the sunlight. So all of your solar farms if you were using solar panels into this system initially, you'd build enough. They already have that setup where there's the center tower, and then all the solar panel mirrors are bouncing the light to that tower so it can pick up different wavelengths of energy, like it's a big lighthouse in the desert. They do it around in Africa and other places for the last 40 years. This system is just a continuation of that, but built right into a trade route of energy. Instead of sitting there and then it has to be interlaced into electrical lines, which are super inefficient. Even if you run it direct current, it's still not as efficient as what I'm describing here. You have to bottle the light and send it along a corridor. So you can get 100% efficiency, 110% efficiency if you have the solar panels as one-way mirrors. And it's capturing all that light and bouncing it without converting it to electrons, which loses some of its energy and heat. And instead, it's just bouncing it into a laser concentrator crystal shape that could be built, manufactured really cheap, mass produced. And then each solar panel array right below it just has a little conch or something on it. And it's just all tight so that desert sand doesn't get in there. And then it's just shooting a concentrated beam of sunlight at your pipeline. So if you have your pipeline running along the middle of the desert, wherever it would, through here and in other ones, then you just run them at a certain temperature frequency. So if the materials of making the pipeline out of the desert sand, it's, say, the melting temperatures for some of the crystals you'd be using would be 1,000 degrees or something. I'm not going to look it all up right now. This is just an example making a point. You could sift various things out of the sand, of course, and make a tunnel that could withstand higher temperatures for very cheap still. Depending upon how much tech, science, and effort you want to apply. But even doing it primitively, 1900 style instead of 21st century style, you could still get it done technically, because jewelers, shaping of glass is pretty easy to do, and it's, really consistent, and the cooling temperature per second is really well understood. So computing systems for printing this type of stuff, for making roadways, and for doing what I'm describing here is quickly becoming feasible as everybody dials in the numbers and gets the software done, gets the equipment built. This is all coming soon. So you go, if the dunes vary in height, you could go underground, under the dunes a little ways, and then you could go up above them just for a little distance, because you don't want too many tight corners, because the bouncing energy off of the mirrors, if you have too many bottleneck corners on this, then that are too tight, it creates hot points, choke points for heat. So that's fine, because you can pretty much make straight long lines of this setup anyways. I was described this briefly in a previous video about getting energy through to a various electrical grids across vast deserts. But I am now, this is the video getting into it fully. So, even if it starts raining somewhat and it turns into, Mexico, Arizona, and starts to get more rain, become more livable and farmable, you can still have your solar panel set up and then just convert it over to other types of energy generation. Now, what do you do with all this hot sunlight? You're pipelining it through, however big the pipe is, bouncing it in various color signals through, but still raw, without any processing that removes electrons. And then it hits down here at the coast of Tunisia at some little town here, like Buchama. Buchama? Bouchama. Okay, so desalinization requires electricity. I'm still developing my concepts around. They did that video about the giant sea turtle luxury, like, cruise ship that I thought was really silly. So I said you could have it, you could beam in energy from the desert and it could be in the bay. And then it would be like have a magnifying glass set up a bottom that would have layers that would let in seawater. And then you would electrolyze, cook it really efficiently with incoming especially lightning storms. And if you have scrubland, because it's not as deserty, and they're always burning down from lightning storms, well, if you have enough of these lightning windmill towers, then they'll strike these first because they're also these wells, right, that I've described. So water's coming up into the tower that's negatively charged on purpose, and it's attracting. Like how trees with too much water in them, lightning will hit them because the electrons run up through the sap. And then it leaps down from the clouds, right? So if you have these towers that are already taller than most common tree types and can be above the forests, and the tines aren't whipping down into the trees, they're all horizontal. So then they start up above the tree line of whatever trees you want to have that can still be 20, 50, 100, 200 feet high. They make these towers ridiculously tall, anyways. So, lightning, right, is mostly light. So, if that light hits the top magnifying glass area of the tower, how do you prevent it from blowing out? Um, well, you have to have electron coils that leap the energy to the other towers, like I described, like Tesla or anybody would say. And then you have circuit breaking of various types so that the electrons from the electricity um, of the incoming lightning hit many, many towers across an array. And as they're attracted in a sequence of timed attraction phases from each of the wells connected to the towers. So then you have lightning kind of being directed because the easiest flow point that it can get to, right? And it'll run along towers for miles. And then you get to whatever point where you've scattered it out far enough and processed all of it. And you've only lost whatever percentage of it in that period for a few seconds to like the degrading signal of the lightning spreading out is the goal, because then it's cooler and the light from it can be directed as soon as it hits right, you can have materials switch and become ionized and become one-way mirrors. And then the percentage of the hot electricity of the lightning is hitting and ricocheting off of the built-in copper or whatever other minerals or whatever you're using, even certain polymers mixed in, to rebound that heat. Then the actual light of the lightning, which might be, depending upon the type of thunderstorm, anywhere from 30 to 70%, or who knows, right? It could be a huge array of variants on that. So if this lightning hits and you beam it without converting it into electrons, into digital currency, into these tunnels, and there's one-way entrances, one-way mirror inputs, and they've condensed into lasers that are however hot. You have to have it all set up so people can't get fried by it. I guess birds will occasionally. When it peaks at certain points, it might fry a bird pretty good. Um, I don't know. But by spreading it all out, you lower risk of everything. That's the whole point, is to master the whole array. And it helps nature. It spreads out the energy. You can have farms from the wells surrounding this whole setup. It allows the entire warm part of the world to be set up for small community family farming, potentially, in the long run, as everybody can invest in these setups and the battery banks required, the coinage required, I've described, to run all of this industry. So if you have these big tubes running at however many degrees of light input through, they're hitting over here, you're ripping clean hydrogen out of the seawater. Then you reach the next issue, where nitrogen is more difficult to generate in the desert somewhat, and more dangerous of explosions and stuff. So how do you cool and compress the hydrogen you're generating? Like, they want to take the excess energy from their desert setups, turn it into compressed hydrogen and oxygen, ship that on boats to different parts of the world to be used for various things, for creating electricity and stuff. So if they're going to do that, in order to make that viable and economically for the foreseeable future, for the next 50 years, you're going to have to go beyond compressing and cooling it to that degree that it's a gas. Because, or I mean, it's a liquid, because that's still, how many times more compressed is it if you are compressing the hydrogen into an actual gem, into an actual sapphire. So you have these giant tunnels of light. They come in, hit here. You got your hydrogen. Now, if you've got a giant pyramid, like Egypt likes pyramids, right? So you are compressing the hydrogen. Now, there's different shapes to hydrogen turning into crystal versus just making a diamond out of some sort of high quality carbon. Right, diamonds are a stop sign. They're five helixes that are combined at different angles, certain simple complex way. Well, you have to study the crystal formation, and you have to compress it correctly, of course. And everybody's already figured this out. But the parameters of doing it at larger sizes. So if you want to make a big crystal and make it big enough that it can be sent over to China from Australia or like Africa. So currently China is building giant fusion reactors to process hydrogen and helium into electricity. So if you have these big crystals, what you need to be focusing on is kind of like hydrogen lathing off of these crystals. So if you have these big reactor donuts, and then you have your crystal energy source. Now, um, everybody already knows that there's the certain mineral that makes the 3DS screen um on Nintendo's 3DS have depth. It's got, two depths to it, whatever that stuff's called. Um Now there's also bauxite, which has 4 levels of potential 3D to it for future applications. So they're eventually going to make a 4DS handheld that has better depth and closeness to the eyes in an even more convincing manner. Now, these materials, you can look this all up when it's mixed with simple clean water, and there's this simple chemical reaction, and it creates clean burning energy with no side residue of any kind, no zero carbon. And so I was describing years ago on videos I made that if you have a big enough factory with hot enough parameters of what it can handle, then you can use a natural breakdown of these minerals and water reacting. And if you use actual crystallized water, like for example, they have, like I described, they should do the breakdown of the crystal water into microparticles again. So then it's like water, but it's dry water and it doesn't melt because it's actually tiny crystals that just look like water and feel like water. But it won't dissolve into your skin because it's not hydrosis, it's crystals. So you can create a super jet medium of energy heat output that's so incredibly hot and steady with no carbon output. um I need to do further contemplation on all of the stages of this, but ultimately, if you need enough energy, hot energy from the sun, to be cleaning water from the ocean, then this is the solution. Um,
Direct current HVDC transmission system in the world. The solar array and battery installation would also be the largest of their kind.
right, batteries. So what I'm describing is batteries that are also bit plumpers. I don't know what to call them. I don't know what they'll be called, but the coinage, like I've described many times, would be compressed metal gases like neodymium for dimes and silver linings on all of them to handle the transmission correctly of the data of throughput. And then you'd have these coin rolls and battery banks, and it'd be just processing en masse all of the sunlight and lightning across whole huge areas with farming going on around underneath. And then you've got all the benefits of the lightning. You can, coil it under the soil in lightning coils and increase the root growth of your crops, um, so that you get um, harvests in half the time usually. This has all been studied out. I've done various videos on it and shown off other people, and seen how it works in person as a kid from various people's fields and how it actually does function if you do it correctly and disperse the electrons correctly into the soil based off of the location on the earth you are, you know, clockwise versus semi or counterclockwise. So this is a solution on every level so that you can turn deserts, you can have your wells, you can have your trees at the edges of the farms again, because they, you know, you plant trees that won't ever get up to the height of the spinning windmills above, whatever they're at 100 feet or whatever. And most trees, you know, you don't need a forest um, everywhere in the world with giant redwoods necessarily immediately to have a successfully green planet. You can have trees, lots of forests are shorter. And so this allows for a general restructuring of the under canopy so that these windmills that are taking this percentage of the sunlight would come down on the farms and the trees edging the farms. And you have enough hydrogen mist off-put concentrate from the storms hitting, because the storms will, as they're generating down and sending your excess hot lightning down into your wells to be grounded into the earth, into the lightning, and into the well water, into the aquifer. This transfusion process with the right polymers and contact points, you can concentrate the hydrogen out of the water and rip it in the process of the spinning cogs that are mirrored and crystals in different places. And the lightning going through, you can concentrate the hydrogen into super concentrated hydrogen vapor water that's stable, that the planet is supporting, the sun is supporting, the whole system is of the living universe you're in. So that I'm trying to describe how this works. Like, the universe is a living body. You have to understand this or you'll never get anywhere in science. So let me just pause to pop my living body in every direction. So a submarine cable, that's much harder to have it be, you know, sending sunlight. So what I'm describing here is mostly for use with on the continent across the desert.
At depth is not fast. In an emergency, restoring the link could take weeks.
See, so then they have to have all of this covering and, you know, heat prevention and stuff. And this pipe, say it's as big around, and say it's 6 feet across diameter. Or even larger, 10 feet, 20 feet. If it was a big mirror chamber with stacked levels, breaking up the sunlight into 8 distinct rainbow colors that bounces along, how much gigawatts per second could you transport compared to having it be solid metal electricity moving along? Plus, electricity is super slow compared to photon form. When it's still a photon from the sun or lightning, it'll rush along and get all the way across a continent in, you know, so little time. It's, you know, insane, right? It's at the speed of light, fully. And when you're compressing it into metal lines, it's way slower. Its data signals are corrupted. You can't use it reliably for different things. So all across this region and over right into especially Australia. You can expect what I'm describing will take place, especially in Australia, because they're already developing it. And then it's somewhat safe because if it's all contained within a pipeline chamber, all that hot sunlight, you don't have animals and people getting fried by it. And then if you have the array of ports numerous enough along the pipe for all of the solar farms to bounce the energy through, then there won't be any certain spot where suddenly all the energy is hitting you through the open air. So I actually don't see a negative strategy to this at all. I mean, it seems pretty practical and straightforward if people are already discussing doing this anyways. So there you go. Some thoughts on it, and I'll see what people come up with off of what I've said, and we can further refine the science of it.